In order to have a clear understanding of how the war on drugs has developed and its lasting consequences, we're going to talk about each one in the context of the president that was in office at the time. So, recall that President Johnson was the first to actually call for the war on drugs. He did so in 1965, and he established a direct role for the federal government in local police operations, their court systems, as well as giving them some responsibility and relationships with state prisons. Um, Johnson really did start the ball rolling. He said that he wanted to be what they called quote or he wanted to develop a quote thorough, intelligent, and effective war against crime. So shortly thereafter, however, Nixon took office, and that's when he really put all of LBJ's thoughts into action. So he declared this war on drugs and dramatically increased the size, presence, and power of federal drug control agencies. He's the one that really ushered in mandatory minimum sentencing, and he began moving us down that trajectory much more quickly. Following uh, Nixon, however, was President Ford, and he was really actually quite concerned with the growth in crime. Um, he touted concern or rhetoric, however, that his quote primary concern were not the offenders but were the victims of crime. In fact, he ran on that platform. He ran on a very victim oriented platform. However, once in office, his main policies that mattered for the war on drugs were designed to increase funding for law enforcement. He supported mandatory sentencing, and he really increased. He really increased the size of the federal law enforcement arm as well, right? So he funded a large number of new U.S. marshals and new U.S. attorneys that were responsible for prosecuting federal crimes, and he also added 500 agents to local areas and another 500 to ATF, which is the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearm branch of the federal government. He also has quoted as saying that he supported, quote, stiff mandatory prison sentences for sellers of heroin and other hard drugs. So although he did adopt this victim-oriented approach, when push came to shove, he continued the same policies hinted at by LBJ and began by Nixon. Now, what's important to note here is most people associate the war on drugs and the war with Reagan. However, um, before Reagan even got there, we already had three presidents that really supported and facilitated the growth of war on drugs. Then came President Jimmy Carter. He actually ran on a campaign of decriminalizing marijuana. During his first year in office, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted to decriminalize up to 1 ounce of marijuana. However, he generally didn't take much more of an active role in changing existing laws. But it's important to note, as I mentioned, this is before Reagan ever entered office, and these presidents had already spent $7 billion fighting the war on drugs. Here's a quote from President Carter in 1997, where he really he was very actually quite forward thinking about drugs, but the problem was, as you might imagine, for a politician to announce to all of the public that they're going to step back off of drugs when we've been told consistently about how concerned we should be and the growing problem of drug abuse. It doesn't look good, right? It doesn't get votes. So although he felt this way, and he did, and still for years and years, even after his presidency, maintain this stance, he generally didn't enact much change. And then in comes Ronald Reagan, and him and his wife Nancy Reagan began this "just say no" to drugs approach, right? So he really refocused the war on drugs, increased severe penalties for drug-related crimes. He really supported and issued a lot of funding to support states for incarcerating both violent and nonviolent drug offenders. And later he passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which has lasting consequences in terms of the mandatory minimums that it set for specific drug offenses. After Reagan came President George H.W. Bush, and he carried on the trend. During his presidency, or well, I'm sorry, it was longer than that, from 1988 to 2006, the U.S. prison population tripled, or just almost tripled. And he was one of the first to really start seeing the consequences of this approach in terms of its effect on the prison system. So he, in September of 1989, interestingly enough, President Bush, during his very first national televised address, and again, this is HW, it's a senior, okay, he blamed, during his national televised conversation with the country, he blamed, quote, everyone who uses drugs for causing, quote, the gravest threat towards America. Thus, you hear the same sort of language initially introduced by LBJ, carried on by Nixon, and so on. He also made some other comments in that address that was not exactly, or it was rather polarizing. He compared the inner city plight he compared the inner city plight, including the issues related to drugs, to civil unrest in countries like Colombia related to drug cartels. He also very famously held up a bag of crack cocaine during the address and used it as like a visual aid. So he later approved the 1033 program, which is, as y'all might recall from the very beginning of this module where we discussed police militarization, that began with a 1033 program. It was known as something different at the time, but that's not important. Now we know it as a 1033 program. And that gave local and state police agencies military-grade equipment specifically for anti-drug efforts. Years later, Bill Clinton comes to office, and he passes the 1994 crime bill that we already discussed. Okay, this bill included $8.7 billion for prison construction. And that's only for states that enacted truth in sentencing, right? So he said, you need to implement these, get tough policies that ensure people are serving much longer of their sentence. And we recognize that's going to cost you money, so here's some money to do it. Truth in sentencing laws require people to serve 85% of their sentence. And, you know, it's important to note that the 1994 crime bill gets blamed for mass incarceration a lot. But as you've now seen, we've already gone through 6 presidents prior to Clinton that were all implementing implementing policies with the same end goal in mind. The one small exception might be President Carter, but otherwise everything has been leading to that point. So that law certainly had powerful consequences, but we were already going in that direction. It's also important to note that law has been cited as being responsible for a notable drop in crime, but criminologists and economists can't really agree as to what's causing the drop in crime or what caused the drop in crime, but they do all agree that it was not the 1994 crime bill. They say usually it's more likely to have been related to any number of, employment was improving, the economy was improving, there was a number of other social issues going on that were considerably more powerful than this law in terms of its effect on crime. And that has a lot to do with because of how fast the prison population was rising. So at some point, prison stops becoming effective in terms of reducing crime. But that's neither here nor there. So then, after Clinton, George Bush Jr., George W. Bush, enters the White Office, and the drug war was starting to kind of put out, right? It was losing a lot of steam and support. However, he allocated more money than anyone prior to him to fighting the war on drugs. The rate of illicit drug use had been remaining relatively constant, but overdose fatalities were rising rapidly, and that kind of was what pushed him to implement some policies to try to get at it. And he encouraged, or he continued what his father had done, facilitating the rapid escalation of militarization of police in terms of fighting the war on drugs. And then 9/11 happened. And obviously his priorities shifted, and a lot of what his legacy became was lost sight, was no longer relevant to the war on drugs. But the policies were still in place, and the consequences were still occurring. So just to give you an idea of what I was discussing earlier about the prison sentence, right here, this is when the prison sentence when president declares the war on drugs. This is in 2010. We've been slowly declining, slowly. This trend's continued, but at one point, for drug offenses in the 70s, 80s, there were 40,000 people in prison, and now we have over 500,000 people. It's important to note, y'all, that this number is accurate, 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States, most of which is as a result of the war on drugs. Okay, but so here is that again, what I was discussing about that the consequences of, or how incarceration affects, how incarceration affects the crime rate, right? So what we see is a bit of a diminishing return. In the beginning, right here, you can see if you zoomed in, and you'd see, right, when as incarceration increases at first, crime decreases, right? That's what that point is. But then there's at some point it's no longer effective, because if it was, the crime rate would be going way down, and it's not. This suggests that incarceration is not necessarily an effective means in reducing crime. And more importantly, it's also not an effective way of reducing drug use. Drug use has stayed the same since 2002 to 2013, and then it actually stayed the same for some time before that as well. But this is as far as that table goes. So you can see, despite efforts to reduce it, and despite this war, we really haven't done much.